Hello, we are from group 5 and now we will discuss about social context of second language acquisitions. There are two levels of context that affect language learning. The first is microsocial and the second is macrosocial. The microsocial focus deals with the potential effects of a difference immediately surrounding circumstances. And the second is the macrosocial. Macrosocial focus relates the second language to broader culture, political, and educational environments. Next, we will discuss about communicative competence. The communicative competence, defined simply as what the speakers needs to know the communicate appropriately within a particular language community. The terms language community refers to a group of people who share knowledge of a common language to at least some extent. Or communicative competence refers to use language to communicate successful or order it as composing competence in 4 areas. The first is words and rules. The second is appropriacy. The third is cohesion and coherence. The last is use of communication strategies. For example, the aim of communicate language teaching and communicate approach in communicative competence. Communicative competence. In the classroom, for example, the testing communicative competence is challenging. A forms teacher can use to evaluate their learners' competence include informations gap and role play activities for speaking, letters for writing, and note taking and the summarizing, which is combined listening and the writing competence. And next, multilingual individuals in both definitions, in one who can communicate in a more than one language, be actively through speaking, writing, or singing. The difference between monolingual and multilingual communicative competence are the first is due in two part different social functions of first, second language learning, and last two difference between learning language and learning cultures. A first language is a child's native language is normally part of his or her native cultures, which is transmitted from one generation to the next generations. A first language is the language a person has learned from his birth. And the second language learning is a part of second cultural learning's adoption. Again, as about there are exclusive sense of ending other language to native language. The first is second language. Second language is generally and used within the context of language community, which is dominantly includes members who speak it natively. For example, the Spanish speakers in USA learning English, or Indonesian speakers in USA or Japan learning Japanese. And the second is about virgin language. The students learning virgin language usually do so within the context of their own native cultures, or the virgin language acquired during early childhood, normally beginning before the age of about 3 years or about 3 years. And the last is auxiliary language. Auxiliary language is a land in a context where it will functions for a political, technological process. For example, may include use of language by a Chinese.
Microsocial factor. Microfactor has three topics. First, variation of L2, which is related to social linguistics. Second, how native speakers of the modify their language of communicate with L2 learns. Third, Vygotsky social cultural theory views interaction as the basic original of the language. Some of the relevant contextual dimensions are linguistic context, element of form and function of the linguistic relate to variable elements, psycholinguistic context, effector relate to the amount of the attention paid to the form of language during its productions, the degree of automatism versus control in processing. Psychological context factors relate to the amount of attention paid of the forms of language during productions. These traits interact significantly with amount of attention paid of the form of language, as illustrated above. Probably that a popula or n versus n will result of the difference between C and have is C to be consistently observed. Speakers usually subconsciously change their pronunciation and even the grammatical complex of the sentences. They use the sound more like whether they are talking to, and given similar linguistic, psychological, and micro context. For example, female immigrants in the USA may hear and use more standard variation than male immigrants of the same language and cultural backgrounds.
And Reagan 1991 examined the pronunciation of ing in Cambodian and Vietnamese immigrants in the Washington D.C. area. Native English-speaking men tend to pronounce ing as in, whereas native women are less likely to do so, perhaps because women tend to be more status conscious and want to use the more prestigious form. While the Cambodian and Vietnamese immigrants produce less in than native speakers overall, there is still a gender division, with males producing in more often than females. Ellis suggests that free variation constitutes an essential stage in the acquisition of grammatical structures. 1997-19. He hypothesizes that the nature of variability changes during the process of second language development in the following steps. Input and interaction. Language input to the learner is absolutely necessary for either first language or second language learning to take place, but the nature of its role is input. Followers of behaviorist learning theories consider input to form the necessary stimuli and feedback which learners respond to and imitate. A single form is used for a variety of functions. Other forms have been acquired but are initially used interchangeably. That the variant forms begin to be used systematically. The non-target forms are eliminated. Removal of free variability is making the EL more efficient. Social approaches also consider the nature and role of interaction in acquisition and ways in which it is helpful and perhaps necessary for the development of advanced level of second language profiles. From a social perspective, interaction is generally seen as essential in providing learners with the quantity and quality of external linguistic input. Active modification can be considered part of her own communicative comprehension acquired as a result of many years experience in teaching young English learners. The type of adaptation that are found in speech to second language learn are similar in some way to be baby talk, used with young children in many languages. Modification of written input for second language learn also typically included controlled vocabulary and shorter, simpler sentence structure. In written academic text, modification means to help second language students understand what they read. In the nature of input modification, then, we found both similarities and differences for first language and second language learners. Some of oral modification may make acquisition easier, but all first language and many second language learners can succeed without them. Modification in written input which improve comprehension are similar for second language and first language students, but richer on their effectiveness.
The nature of interactional modification. Along with input, social interaction is also important for first language acquisition. No child can learn their initial language simply by listening to tapes, radio broadcasts, on television programs. In contrast, many second language students gain at least some level of competency without interacting directly with speaker of the target language and for at least some highly motivated. Delegates have a very high level of second language proficiency, so they should be considered successful learners. Repetition by native speaker or NSS of part of all of their previous utterance allow non-native speakers or NNSS more time for processing and opportunity to confirm or correct perception. Vertical construction allow NNSS to construct discourse sequences beyond their current independent means. Comprehension checks and requests for clarification by NSS focus NNSS attention of segment of sentence which are unclear, and such check and requests by NNSS inform NSS where repetition paragraph. These are important devices in negotiation of meaning between NSS and NNSS which help in preventing.
Feedback. Feedback is information that a learning receives about their language. Learning and most commonly refers to information about their language production in speaking or writing. Although it can also consider reading and listening, study skill, attitude, effort, and so on. For example, something I really appreciate about you. I think you did a great job. I would love to see you done more. I really think you have a supervisor. On of the things I admire about you. I can see you have a positive impact.
Intake to cognitive processing. In long opinion, to summarize the insertionist perspective, then what is acquired in L2 include only that portion of L2 input which is assimilated and fit into the EL system is acquired in a dynamic interplay of external input and internal processes, with insertion facilitating but not causing SLA. and the reason that some learners are more successful than others include their degree of access to social experience, which allow for negotiation of meaning and corrective feedback. However, receptional interaction as short and stimulus for learning ignored as autodidact who teach themselves from books and recording. Furthermore, this perspective addresses is only a limited way the evidence for universal sequences in auto-learner. The second is introduction as the genesis of language. As you can see on PPT, according to SG theory, learning occurs when simple innate mental activities are transformed into higher order, more complex mental function. This transformation typically involves symbolic meditation, which is a link between a person's current mental state and higher order function that is provided primarily by language. This is considered the usual route to learning, whether what is being learned is language itself or some other area of knowledge. The result of learning through meditation include learning having heightened awareness of their own mental abilities and more control over their thought processes. And the last is interpersonal interactions. More generally, the metaphor of scaffolding refers to verbal guidance with an expert provided to help a learner perform any specific task, or the verbal correlation of peers to perform a task which would to be difficult for any one of them individually. Very importantly, scaffolding is not something that happens to a learner as a passive receive, but happen with a learner as an active participation.
Thank you for the time given to me. My name is Dianova Tanaim. I will explain about interpersonal interaction. Communication that occurs within an individual's own mind. This is also viewed by Vygotsky as a sociocultural phenomenon. When reading, for example, we engage in interpersonal as well as interpersonal activity. We draw interactively on our ability to decode print. Our stored knowledge of the language we are reading and the contents themed through which our knowledge of the world is organized. A second type of interpersonal interaction that occurs frequently in beginning stage of second language learning and in later stage when the content and structure of second language input stretch or goes beyond exciting language competence, make use of first language resource. This take place through translation to oneself as part of interpretive problem solving process. Yet another type which was of particular interest to Vygotsky is private speech. This is the self-talk which many children, in particular, engage in the light of the inner speech that more mature individuals use to control talk and behavior, while inner speech is not necessarily tied to the surface from forms of any specific language. Private speech is almost always verbalized in first language and second language. Study of private speech, when it is audible, provides a window into the mind of source from research through which we can actually observe
interpersonal interaction taking place and perhaps discover of its function in second language acquisition. Overall, socioculture theory claims that language is learned through social mediated activities. The SC framework support the view that some learners may be more successful than others because of their level of access to or participation in learning community or because of the amount of meditation they receive from experts of peers and because of how well they make use of the help. I think that's all. Thank you.
Okay, next, there are challenges to sociocultural oriented view of language acquisition. However, the following two facts of are the somewhat difficult to explain if we hold a strong position that social interaction is an essential causative force in second language learning. Some individuals are able to achieve a relative advanced level of language second proficiency without the benefit of any interpersonal communication. Some individuals in extensive interaction with speakers of another language with learning that language to any significant degree. This included the following: the second one, background, knowledge, and experience which help individuals organize new information and make use about what is the going on and what will happen next. The second, understanding of the overall situation or event including its goal and the relationship among participants, extra-linguistic context, including physical setting and objects, and the third, knowledge of genre-specific discourse structure, prospect, features of tone and stress to convey emotional state in spite of cultural difference. In each of these elements, there is often enough commonality to allow at least some level of meaningful communicate between people who do not speak some language. Communicate events cannot be competent with a common language in the absence of familiar context and props. Of course, students studying in a foreign country, for example, cannot understand our language first translation. However, they may be able to function quite adequate in many social situations while still possessing only limited linguistic resources. In if individuals have a neat opportunity to develop increasing competence in the language second, they will do so if they language may not even if they have ample social opportunity. Thank you.
Macro-social factor. We now shift to consideration of macro-social factor in looking at how social context affect SLA, drawing firmly on framework of the ethnographic of communication and social psychology. This broader society appreciates in research of theory and allow exploration in issues such as identity, status, and value influence second language outcomes and why. The macro social factor we will consider are several levels in the ecological context SLA. 1. Global and national status of first language and second language. 2. Boundaries and identities. 3. Instructional force and constraints. 4. Social categories and the last circumstance of learning. At a global and national level, influence on SLA involves the power of states of learn, native and target language, whatever overtly state in official policy or covertly released in cultural values and practice. Global and national states of first language and second language. Language have a power and state at global and national level for both symbol of practical reason. An important symbolic function of language is political identification and cohesion. We see this in the USA, for example, where English is generally accepted in the single national language, and most people consider it important for national unity that all citizens be able to use one language.
Boundaries and identities. Part of identify function of language is accomplished by creating or reinforcing national boundaries. But linguistic boundaries often also exist within or across national borders. The function of unification is illustrated by the official use of Hebrew in Israel and English in Nigeria as part of the process for establishing those nation-states. Language communities may also reinforce their boundaries by discouraging prospective second language learners by holding and conveying the attitude that their language is too difficult or inappropriate for others to use. Crossing a linguistic boundary to participate in another language community and to identify or be identified with it requires learning that language. Full participation also commonly requires learning the culture of that community and adapting to those values and behavioral patterns, for example, acculturation. Social psychologists who study second language acquisition emphasize the effect of motivation on whether groups of immigrants or ethnic minorities integrate culturally and linguistically into the dominant society. The same general motivational factors account for why dominant groups members often do not learn a minority community. John Schumann identified other group factors that affect second language acquisition outcomes negatively in his acculturation models. For example, factors that are likely to create social distance between learner and target groups, limit acculturation, and thus inhibit second language learning are dominance of one group over the other, a high degree of segregation between groups, and desire of the learner groups to preserve its own lifestyles.
Strengths and constraints that concern us most here: social control regarding language, determining access to knowledge, and other examples of linguistic privilege or discrimination in the language they speak. On the other hand, that far political office holders need to represent the speak other language. Competence in that language can also be assessed and may be mandate. For example, the presidential election campaign in the US have featured candidates who speak in Spanish as well as in English in the territory of the country, which has strong blocks Spanish L1 voters. Despite the de facto national status only in English, the use of even some words on varas in Spanish is meant to convey symbolic message that candidates worry about the segment population. On the other hand, in Bolivia and Guatemala, Spanish is still recently spoken natively only by a minority, but their economic status and the institutionalization of Spanish as an official language made it is possible for them to maintain control of Quechua or Aymara and Maya language one, respectively, as a side effect. Multilingual competence difference in immigrants' family can lead to disintegration of traditional family structures such as children who learn the dominant language in school become translators and brokers for the parents in meeting service, reverse power structures and undermine parental authority.
Social categories. People are categorized according to many socially relevant dimensions. The first sex, the second is ethnicity, the third is education level, occupation, and economic status. Such categorization often influence what experience they have, how they are perceived by others, and what expected of them. When they are L2L learners, members of different social categories frequently experience different learning conditions and different attitudes. Therefore, this is another level we need to consider in the macrosocial context of SLA. Biological factors, which generally favor of younger age for SLA, can also be overridden by contexts in which older learners, such as in SLA to the level of being able to pass for a native speaker or even in pronunciation, and when social motivation is strong enough. The perceptions that members of one ethnic category are more or less privileged than another are determined in large part by which group in politically and economically dominant in a multi-ethnic society, which is also often the one that has majority status. Next, circumstances of learning. The final macro-social factors in the ecological context of SLA that we will consider are circumstances of learning. These are part of the larger social context within which SLA takes place because learning begins with children's first experience with the families into which they are born, the communities to which they belong, and the cultural environment within which they live. By that time, children begin their formal education at the age of 5 or 6. We already note in Chapter 3 that learning differences in cognitive style and learning strategies are at least partly based in the experience. The difference between field-dependent and field-independent cognitive style, for example, correlates with how children arise. Another fundamental difference in situational circumstances is whether second language learning is informal versus formal or naturalistic versus instructed. Informal or naturalistic learning generally takes place in settings where people context and need interact with speakers of another language. Second language learners, who are majority first language speakers, often have access only to foreign language programs, which offer the second language as an academic subject and give little opportunity for students to develop full communicative competence. No individual factors in the macro-social context of SLA can be isolated from others. A clear example of culture-based learning strategies is in the superior capacity for rote learning among Asian students who have had more experience with teaching methods and involved with memorization.
And SLA is quite limited.